Imagine a wooden cart rolling into the town square, dust trailing behind it. Men gather, women pull children close. The magistrate climbs the scaffold. The ropes creak. A hush falls over the crowd, and in that hush, you hear the logic of an entire society. Punishment is not only retribution. Punishment is theater. It is law turned into a public lesson, carved into the memory of every witness. The punishments of colonial America were designed first and last to be seen, to instruct, to terrify, and to reinforce the moral order the rulers wished to preserve. Colonial society grew under two powerful myths. One was religious. Sin was visible, and public penance kept a community pure. The other was pragmatic. In a precarious frontier world, order had to be manufactured, quickly and visibly. For leaders in Puritan New England, in plantation Virginia, and in the uncertain towns of the middle colonies, the scaffold and the pillory were tools of governance. The magistrate who sentenced a man to the stocks or a woman to the whipping post understood something the community knew by instinct. Public pain spoke louder than any sermon. Start with the stocks and the pillory devices that look quaint in a museum, but were instruments of sustained humiliation. A person placed in the stocks might sit immobilized for hours, sometimes exposed for days. The head and hands locked in timber, the offender could be pelted with mud, rotten vegetables, or worse insults, and spit. The pillory, with its elevated platform and locked headpiece, offered the crowd a target they could not resist. For petty crimes, drunkenness, gossip, minor theft, the pillory taught neighbors to police one another. It taught that to violate norms was to invite the full attention of your fellows. We underestimate how sharp shame feels. The stocks were a lesson designed to be felt in bones. But humiliation was only the beginning. Colonial law sanctioned corporal punishment, lashes with a whip, brandings, and amputations, sometimes in ways that made salvation conditional on suffering. A common sentence for theft involved the lash. Judges set a number of strokes. The executioner's whip cracked. The straps cut skin. Punishments were calibrated to class and status. A servant might receive far worse treatment than a free man for the same theft, because legal systems treated property and social hierarchy as inseparable. Branding, placing an iron symbol on a convict's skin, made transgression permanent. A burned letter on a cheek or hand was a life sentence of shame. Society could always read the guilt at a glance. The whip for women carried extra cruelty because it wound humiliation and gendered control together. The lash exposed a woman's physical body to public viewing in a way few punishments did. Wives and daughters who scandalized the town adulteresses, those who violated sexual or religious codes, could be paraded to the whipping post. The whip not only punished an act, it told other women where the line lay. This was punishment as gendered pedagogy. For more serious crimes, the colonies reserved even stranger instruments. The ducking stool, associated with controlling disorderly women and alleged scolds, combined ritual humiliation with bodily danger. The offender was repeatedly immersed in river or pond water, sometimes tied to a chair and bound to a plank that tipped her in and out of the water. It was a performance of purification, belief, and spectacle converging, but also a practice that could kill. People drowned under the pretense of purification. Then there were punishments that sprang from English legal tradition, but took unique local flavors in the colonies. One of the most brutal was peine forte et dure in practice, pressed to death, applied in the rarest and most dramatic of cases. If an accused refused to plead to avoid forfeiture of property, the court sometimes resorted to piling heavy weights upon the body until the person yielded or died. In colonial America, that extreme measure is most famously associated with Giles Corey, pressed during the Salem witch trials when he refused to enter a plea. He reportedly cried only more weight as the stones were added. The scene reads like a moral parable and a horror, the state literally flattening the body to force compliance. That pressing was a legal tool, and an ultimate act of coercion. Public execution by hanging, perhaps the ultimate colonial spectacle, served a different purpose but the same logic. The gallows were the town's final stage. Judges, ministers, and sometimes large crowds would assemble to watch the state unmake a life. Hanging was theatrical and didactic. Sermons before the drop detailed the vices of the condemned. An execution turned a criminal into a cautionary tale. Hangers were sometimes bungled, producing slow strangulation rather than the quick fracture of the neck. An agonizing death that spectators might rationalize as deserved. The crowd's presence converted private guilt into civic lesson. Hanging told a community what order looked like when enforced by mortal consequence. Witchcraft prosecutions reveal the extreme mix of religion, fear, and law. In New England, accusations of witchcraft were public and contagious. A single allegation could metastasize into a courtroom full of dramatized fits, spectral evidence, and children's testimonies. The punishments for witchcraft were severe execution, property confiscation, social obliteration. The Salem trials of 1692 stand as a chilling apex. Neighbors testifying against neighbors, spectral evidence accepted, and the machinery of legal terror doing the work of social purification. Witches, whether guilty in any rational sense or scapegoats for a community's anxieties, were made into spectacle and then erased. But the colonies were not monochrome. Different legal cultures produced different cruelties. In the Chesapeake world of plantations, punishment had to control not only crime but labor, and here the law met the machinery of slavery. Slave codes, passed in colonial assemblies, codified a different moral economy. Enslaved people were property, and violence was an instrument of discipline and deterrence. Whippings for minor infractions, branding to mark escapees. Breaking, for those who resisted labor were part of an architecture of domination. The lash was a theater, merely for the town square. It was applied in fields and yards, often in private, as a way of maintaining the economic engine of the colony. Where Puritan Virginia punished for moral infractions to preserve communal purity, plantation societies used pain as an economic tool to preserve order and profitability. Perhaps the cruelest thing about these punishments was not their physical brutality, but their symbolic purpose. They taught people their place in a rigid social order. The scaffold, the stocks, the whipping post, the ducking stool, they were infrastructure. They told the powerless how fragile their position was, and they told rulers how easy it was to convert law into spectacle. In a world with few prisons and little administrative capacity for incarceration, spectacle stood in for sustained social control. The public nature of punishment made it sticky. The shame in memory traveled with witnesses back to family, parish, and workplace. If you are hearing this and thinking, how could a community accept such things? Remember that it was a different moral universe. Ministers explained, magistrates rationalized, neighbors participated. The same people who distributed bread at the parish feast stood under the gallows the next week and declared it righteous. The brutality is horror. The complicity is education. Before we keep going, before we move inside the madhouses and behind closed doors, pause. Tell me where you're watching from. The history of punishment is not only ancient, it is local. Different colonies and towns framed discipline differently. And if you want the next chapter, where we move from public spectacle to private cruelty, into the jails, the workhouses, and the brutal world of punishment behind closed doors, make sure to subscribe, drop a comment, and share this with someone who can stand more truth about our past. We have all seen the town square in our mind, the stocks, the gallows, the crowd. But those public images were only one face of colonial cruelty. Behind taverns and church steeples were locked rooms, backyards, and plantation pens, where punishment was both more intimate and more sustained. If the scaffold taught lesson in a single breath, the private punishments taught it in weeks, months, and years. Their logic was not spectacle, but regimented control. Here, Pain was a slow instrument of social ordering, the shaping of bodies into labor, the erasure of resistance, the remaking of identity. Jails in colonial America were more than detention centers. They were holding pits where the poor, debtors, and accused waited in degrading conditions for trial or auction. There were few purpose-built penitentiaries until the late 18th and early 19th centuries. For most of the colonial era, confinement meant overcrowded cells, no sanitation, little food, and a simmering mix of violence and disease. The jailer often had extraordinary power. He set the diet, the hygiene, and the rules. Families could bribe for better treatment. The poor could not. Debtors sat for months because legal systems prioritized creditor claims. Punishment by incarceration was therefore a cruelty of class as much as law. The physical consequences, scurvy, dysentery, exposure were lethal in a world where medical knowledge was primitive and jail conditions abysmal. Forced labor was the backbone of penal practice. In some colonies, convicted criminals were sold into indenture or bound out as servants, their sentences converted into commodity value. This was punishment that doubled as profit. Whether on farms, in towns, or on ships, the convict laborer was valuable. The colony transformed punishment into economic utility. For colonists struggling to staff their settlements, this was an attractive arrangement. But for the men and women whose sentences were work, the experience was often brutal. Overwork, inadequate food, and continuous supervision destroyed bodies and spirits alike. The cruelty of maiming as punishment deserves special attention because it is a form of violence that permanently rewires a person's life. In English common law, which the colonies inherited, certain crimes could be punished by amputation, cutting off a hand, for instance, for theft. Colonial magistrates sometimes invoked these standards, or at least threatened them, to control theft and maintain order. It is hard to underestimate the horror of losing a hand in a world where manual labor was the main means of survival. Maiming erased both future livelihood and social dignity. A maimed body was marked in the most literal sense. For the rest of life, everyone could see what the convict had been judged to be. If maiming made shame permanent on the body, branding made infamy permanent on the skin. Brands could be letters marking thieves, traitors, or slaves who escaped iron scorched onto flesh was a visible legal record. For enslaved people, branding had an additional function as a deterrent. A runaway who returned could be branded, and a brand remained legible even after time and scarring. The brand helped managers and owners reclaim property and functioned as a warning to the rest. We must now discuss the system that institutionalized cruelty on an industrial scale: slavery. In plantation colonies Virginia, the Carolinas, and later the Deep South, the law and custom created a regime of terror designed to extract labor and crush rebellion. Enslaved people were subject to summary punishments for infractions real or imagined. The whip, long discussed in public punishments, was here also private and routine. But the private lash could be worse because the slaveholder controlled the terms. Whippings were not calibrated by law in the same way as magistrate-ordered lashes. They were acts of will and profit. Records from colonial newspapers, from private correspondence, and from court cases occasionally reveal whippings that left bodies raw, unable to work, sometimes fatally injured. The plantation doctor could be summoned to repair flesh, only to return the slave to labor. Beyond the lash, slave codes permitted catastrophic violence, separation of families by sale, branding of runaways, and courts that often denied enslaved persons the protections of white colonists. Some legal frameworks enabled owners to administer corporal punishment without the prosecutorial checks that a free person might expect. When violence is private, it leaves fewer witnesses and fewer legal constraints. Thus, the plantation context enabled a cruelty, both normalized and concealed. Sexual violence was a central, corrosive element of punishment. Control, and domination in colonial contexts. Enslaved women and girls were vulnerable to sexual coercion by owners and managers. The law often treated coerced sexual relations as property disputes rather than crimes against persons. A woman raped by her master was simultaneously the subject of legal silence and economic predation. This perverse logic made gendered punishment both private and structural. Children born of these relations were often kept as property. Their births could compound the power of the owner. In ports and on ships, another cruelty appears in the shape of impressment and maritime discipline. Sailors, whether indentured or conscripted, faced draconian codes at sea. Mutiny, desertion, and insubordination could be punished with flogging, keel-hauling in earlier maritime traditions, or marooning in remote places. The ocean was a realm where legal protections were thin, and where punishment could be immediate and brutal. For colonists building Atlantic empires, the sea was as much a stage of private violence as plantation yards were. Colonial courts sometimes authorized more theatrical physical punishments intended to communicate moral lessons. Stocks and pillories gave way in some places to ear cropping, cutting off a portion of an ear, or to having the offender's nose slit. These mutilations were designed specifically to prevent reintegration into decent society. A disfigured face carried the label of a criminal to every marketplace and meeting house. Mutilation was both a punishment and a brand. It eliminated anonymity. A chilling aspect of colonial cruelty was its bureaucratic vocabulary. Legal forms, docket entries, and parish records sanitize human suffering. A docket might list fornication and a fine, or vagrancy and a term of service, or rebellion and a whipping. The ledger's dry language masks the bodies that endured. If you follow the records, you see patterns. The poor punished more harshly for vagrancy. Immigrants punished more for petty theft. Women punished for sexual impropriety. The law looked neutral on paper. In practice, it enforced hierarchies. We must also recognize more insidious forms of punishment: ostracism and exile. In small towns, expelling a person from community life could be devastating. You could be banished to the frontier, forced into remote servitude, or simply denied the moral and material networks that sustained life. For many, the difference between a civic life and banishment was the difference between bread and starvation. Finally, remember the context. Colonial America was a frontier of legal experimentation and improvisation. Magistrates adapted, and sometimes invented punishments to respond to local needs. The result was a patchwork of cruelty different in each colony, in each town, based on economics, theology, and demography. Across these variations, however, runs a single theme. Punishment often served social order more than justice. Pain was a tool to be applied where authority needed to declare itself. In the next and final part, we will examine the most infamous instruments: legal executions, witchcraft punishments that crossed the boundary of law and terror, and the enduring legacies of colonial cruelty in American institutional practice. We will close by asking what these punishments tell us about power itself, and what lessons, if any, we have learned. If Part 1 showed punishment as public sermon, and Part 2 unmasked the private machinery that enforced labor and control, Part 3 must confront the extremes. Here we face the state's ultimate machinery, the instruments that took life or reshaped it permanently. We also confront the long shadow these choices cast across time, how colonial practices normalized certain violences, and how echoes of those practices persist. Witchcraft trials are the acid test for colonial cruelty because they expose how law, fear, and rumor can cohere into lethal policy. We often remember Salem as an anomaly, a region of peculiar panic, but the witchcraft phenomenon spanned much of colonial English America. The logic was perverse and undeniably religious. Unseen specters tortured the godly, and the accused were complicit. The practice of admitting spectral evidence, testimony that a person's image or apparition tormented a victim, opened the courts to the ephemeral and the hysterical. In Salem, social tensions, land disputes, religious factionalism, gender anxieties caught in a fever that reached the courtroom. The consequences were fatal. Numerous people were executed, and others were imprisoned or driven from their homes. Giles Corey's pressing underscores how state power could crush a single body to enforce legal formality. Other accused were hanged after trials that modern readers perceive as travesties of justice. Execution itself merits careful attention. Hanging was the standard method for capital punishment in most English colonies. It was intended to be both punitive and pedagogical. The scaffold sermon explained the crime and the moral error and urged spectators to repent. The visual finality of the hangman's noose was a civic punctuation mark. But the mechanics of execution, maladjusted ropes, bungled knots, inexperienced hangmen could transform judicial death into prolonged suffering. There are recorded cases of hangings that were botched, where the condemned suffered slow strangulation. Some communities rationalized this as deserved torment. Others were horrified. Execution was thus a ritual that navigated between solemnity and cruelty. Occasionally more unusual forms of capital condemnation were used. Burning was associated with heresy on the continent, and while burning at the stake was less common in British North America than in Europe, it remained a lurid symbol of ultimate ostracism. In some colonial contexts, naval or military punishments, firing squads appeared for crimes like mutiny. Courts martial had their own brutal logics. The death penalty's purpose, beyond retribution, was deterrence and moral pedagogy. But the colony's appetite for execution tells us about a culture willing to equate error with mortal fate. To watch a neighbor die publicly was to internalize fear and to accept state violence as a boundary marker. Yet executions, like other punishments, were not evenly distributed. Social status, gender, and race shaped who was more likely to face death, a poor man more likely than a wealthy one, a person of color more vulnerable in some colonial contexts. Remember that colonials also imported European practices that were not strictly legal punishments, but became tools of social terror. Lynching-like violence, vigilantism, and mob coercion. Where formal law could not or would not act, extrajudicial actors often did. Public violence without legal sanction was a cousin to sanctioned brutality. It told communities whose lives were expendable. Colonial records contain incidents where mobs executed alleged criminals or suspected traitors, sometimes motivated by rumor or fear rather than evidence. Colonial cruelty also extended into the realm of forced migration and dispossession. Native American communities suffered under policies of removal, coerced conversion, and punitive raids practices that were part punishment, part imperial strategy. When colonists exacted reprisals against native communities, burning villages, destroying crops, or forcing relocation, these actions had the logic of punishment writ large. Collective penalty for perceived transgression, often rationalized with a veneer of security or justice. For those on the receiving end, these were not legal sanctions, but war crimes. For colonists, they were governance. We must not close without addressing the gendered and racialized legacies of colonial punishments. The colonial legal imagination mapped vulnerability unevenly. Women, especially those who deviated from expected roles, midwives, accused of witchcraft, unmarried mothers punished for fornication, found themselves at the intersection of legal cruelty and gendered surveillance. Enslaved people and indigenous peoples occupied the contrary end. Their bodies were directly subject to commodified violence. The law that permitted branding, flogging, and sale of enslaved persons made cruelty a structural fact, not an aberration. Finally, consider the institutional legacies. Prisons, jails, penitentiaries, and systems of incarceration grew from colonial practices. The 18th and 19th century reformers who built penitentiaries inherited the logic Thomas Jefferson and other reform-minded elites criticized. that confinement could be a moral technology to reform the soul. But they also inherited the colonial impulse to remove certain lives from the public sphere. In the modern United States, mass incarceration and disparate punishment fall along lines that colonial sanctions helped to sketch. The key lesson of colonial cruelty is not just historical horror, it is caution. When law is used primarily to protect certain privileges, property, racial hierarchy, religious order, it will manufacture cruelty where it must. When community survival is imagined as a closed circle that excludes some lives, the instruments of discipline will become ever more savage. Conversely, when law is restrained by robust norms of due process and shared humanity, cruelty recedes. So what do we do with this knowledge? We begin by refusing to sentimentalize the past. We must teach the truth that legal systems can be engines of terror when they are unbalanced by rights, oversight, and humanity. We must also look for the traces, the places where colonial patterns persist. We must ask if current systems of punishment disproportionately harm the poor, racial minorities, or marginalized communities. Finally, we insist upon historical memory. We honor the lives broken by public spectacle, private whipping, and institutional erasure by telling their stories accurately. If colonial America's punishments shock you, let that shock become action historical literacy that resists repeating old sins. The scaffold's lesson should be not how to punish, but how to build systems that make punishment rarer, fairer, and honest about the dignity of every human life.